So good morning, everybody. You're very welcome to this morning's webinar. My name is Rose Kervick and I'm a director with Accountant Online, and I'm joined today by HR expert Fredricka of Voltedge. So Voltedge works with small startup companies as well as large multinationals on HR strategy and management. And we've asked Fredricka to join us before, and Fredricka always provides the latest insights in what's happening in HR. And it seems that there's a lot happening this year that we really need to be aware of as business owners. So I'm going to be here to monitor the chat, put all your questions in there, and we're going to be recording. We are recording this morning's session, so you'll receive a follow-up email and you'll get the slides and the recording. But the benefit of being on the live event, of course, is that you get to ask your questions live and how they pertain to you. So do use that opportunity. It'll help hopefully dispel some of the anxieties around this area, because it is such an enormous and important area of business. So Fredricka, take us through. I know you've got a lot to cover, and it's not just HR updates. You're going to kind of reflect on perhaps the changing environment that's going on, and help us be aware of what we need to be doing to have a successful organization, a successful business.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rose. Lovely to be here, and welcome everybody. Delighted to have a chance to chat to all of you. I'm going to just give you a whistle-stop tour on the employment law changes, and my goodness, it's been a busy few years with regards to employment law, between new codes, waiting for the bills that are to go through the Oireachtas, and lots of new pieces of legislation. So we've quite a few things there that I'm going to talk about. Also wanted to just kind of recap on some of the, I suppose, the basic principles of our relationship with employees, sustaining and building good relationships. I think at the end of the day, if we can create environments where we can all flourish, then I think it is an opportunity for everybody to progress. And of course, much of, that relationship between a manager and an individual comes down to, have you got the right people in the right place at the right time? And so that prompts us to look at our recruitment strategy. It prompts us to look at, have we got good alignment with what employees are being asked to do and what the business needs them to do? Are we investing in skills development? Are we, driving all of those right cultural environment pieces? And also overall, wellness is definitely front and center of all of our agendas now. And we need to make sure that we are doing enough to look after our people and look after ourselves. And I think, I'm sure I've said it to you before, Rose, it is a business critical thing. Can we afford not to look after ourselves if we're business leaders? And if we're looking at the whole side of risk, well, if we are the CEO or the general manager, if we are critical to the business and we're not taking all of those proactive steps ourselves, then that is a risk. And also, we're not demonstrating maybe good role modeling to our people. So anyway, lots of things for us to talk about. So let me get started on the employment law updates, and I'll run through this, and Rose, if you want to ask me any question as we go through, please do. So as you can see, there's already quite a list of things. So the Work-Life Balance and Miscellaneous Provision Bill of 2022, I'll explain what that is, and that really is around the opportunity of flexible working. It also looks at the whole area of the right to request remote work, and we know that over the last 2 years or so, we've seen a lot of discussion and debate around that code of practice that came in. And of course, what we've all been doing during the pandemic is not remote working, it's crisis management. So remote working is a proactive modeling of a way of working. And I think we all went into working from home or working from somewhere else that might not have been the ideal design. Changes in sick law or sick leave, and that became effective from January 1st, 2023. Also, just no harm to mention about the minimum wage change and also the payment of wages. This is in relation to tips and gratuities, so there was a change there. Two very important new codes of practice in relation to bullying and harassment. So I'll concentrate a little bit more on those. Changes in the protective disclosure legislation, and also a new EU directive on transparent and predictable working conditions that I think people will be interested to learn a little bit more about. So the first one, work-life balance and miscellaneous provisions. So this new legislation provides the right for medical leave for carers and children aged 12 and under. So basically what it is doing is giving employees entitlement to 5 additional unpaid leave days to support a family member or somebody within their household. No prior notice is required, but obviously it does need to be confirmed after the fact. And employers may ask for a medical cert to justify the leave as it was taken. Now, this is separate to force majeure. So force majeure is paid leave, and an employee can take up to 3 days in any 12-month period and up to 5 days in any 3 years. So the right to request flexible working arrangements is also another provision that came in this bill, and that's flexible working arrangements defined as changing work arrangements. So that's work patterns or working hours. And employees, so there is a qualification period on this. They must have at least 6 months continuous service. The employee does need to give notice, and the employer is expected to kind of respond within the 4 weeks. And the employer must access the variability of flexible working arrangements during that period. So you must consider, is it reasonable or not? Can you accommodate it? So it is an important thing that in that 4-week period that you use the period to really evaluate and come back to the employee. Now, the grounds for postponing it would be similar to how you might postpone parental leave, but it is an entitlement. So if you're postponing it, you must have a viable reason, obviously, to do that, and you must be able to come back and provide an alternative time for the individual to take it.
And Fredricka, you know how this is a bill? Does that mean that it's okay? So you're going to talk about when we need to do this? Yeah.
Okay. So it hasn't come through yet, but this is giving us sight of it. So it means that we can start making provision that it is something that we need to get ready for. So it's developing out good remote working or blended working policies, obviously at this stage is a good idea. And look, I think all businesses it's a topic of conversation. All businesses are trying to get that model right for their organization. And, there's lots of businesses that have gone remote only, but we know too that, the relationships we have with people are enhanced when they're in person. So that doesn't mean they have to be in person all of the time, but it does mean that we have to carve out and create situations where we can meet in person to ensure we're investing in that relationship.
And Fredricka, we have a question from Sophia, who's asked, because I know some of these bills or acts that are changing are because of EU directives. Is this right to request remote working an EU directive?
It is as a result of an EU directive, yes.
Okay.
So this is a directive that we knew was coming for some time. And then COVID hit. And then the Taoiseach at the time wanted to try and progress the setup of remote working, because obviously that was an issue that was important for all companies. So this whole code of practice came in then around the right to request remote working. And of course, we know that has rumbled on, and there's been lots of kind of discussion and debate around whether it's right or wrong, or whether the provisions are, comprehensive enough or whatever. So now that right to request remote work will be subsumed into this new legislation.
Okay, so just to answer Sophia then, each of those European countries in EU will have to implement it in some way in their own countries.
Exactly. And, some countries would already have a lot of this set up anyway, so it might not mean there's much of a change, but it is as a result of an EU directive. Yeah.
Thank you.
So this right to so the Work-Life Balance Miscellaneous Provision Act. So this obviously is going to include the right to request remote work, and it's, as I say, it's going to be integrated. So once enacted, it will give employees the legal right to request remote work, and we have known that that's coming for some time. It's just all of the other justifiable grounds that I think there has been the debate. But interesting, there's fewer on this new list than there were in that other bill that we were looking, or that other code we were looking at previously. So it's not enacted yet. Definitely one to watch for, but I think it's inevitable. We're going to have a situation where employees will have the right to request it, and we know that there's going to be the right for certain individuals, when they meet a certain criteria, for them to have flexible working and additional time off. So that's definitely something that is on its way. The changes under sick leave. So as I say, this was a piece of legislation from last year, but it actually wasn't enacted and effective until the 1st of January this year. And it is making provision for paid sick leave. And as you can see, over the next few years, it's going to increase. So right now, employees would have the right to 3 days paid sick leave. I suppose we've had a lot of change around sick leave as a result of COVID. If you remember, you were supposed to provide a social welfare payment, or you're supposed to apply for social welfare payment pre-COVID. And that moved, that it used to be after the 3rd day of sickness, then it moved after the 5th day of sickness, and then COVID happened, and it became immediate that if you were COVID positive, you would immediately get a COVID payment, could immediately take sick leave. So obviously that doesn't exist anymore. That was an immediate provision that was made. But it did shine the light on the whole area of sick leave, and the fact that for some, they don't take time off work because they're sick, because they're not going to be paid, and there's still that waiting period. So that's a difficulty for many people. So now this new legislation is going to introduce it where if you are certified sick, that you can actually get paid for it. Now we are seeing some employers deciding that they will keep their pay, the rate of pay for the day as is, rather than actually the payment of 70% or up to 110 euros a day, because that's what the legislation says. And the reason why some employers are doing that is because it's actually really hard to manage from a payroll point of view, so you're trying to calculate the 70% or the 110, and can be quite, if you've more than, depending on obviously how many people you have, it can be a kind of a challenge from a payroll point of view. So again, that's going to be discretionary, and employers obviously can decide to top it up or not. Okay. But again, you need to just look at what you have in your contract in relation to what provision you've said about sick leave, and also just to look at your policy in your handbook in relation to your sick leave.
Okay, so in that regard, Fredricka, for sick leave, then it's up to the individual company to set those parameters or those requirements. Is that it?
That's it. I mean, the legislation is saying that you must pay up to 3 days in any for the first year. That'll increase to 5 days in 24 and onwards. The eligibility is that the employee must be with you for at least 13 weeks of service, and the rate of pay is 70% of the employee's pay, of normal pay, up to 110. So it's a max of 110 per day cost to the employer.
Thank you, Fredricka. We have a couple of questions about the remote working, because I know it hasn't been enacted yet, so I suppose we're not certain, but you might have an idea of how to direct the participants on the webinar. So Christoph has asked, what if the employee, I think Christoph means employer, disapproves the request for remote working, even if the employee meets the requirements? Where and how can the employee seek justice? Okay, so good question.
Yeah, so I think any employee relations matter where, you know, the relationship between the employee and the employer is in conflict, the WRC is going to be your place to go for support. And I think sometimes employees, or maybe employers as well, feel that the WRC is only accessible if the relationship is broken down and they're the employee is no longer employed. That's not the case.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. I would have had that impression, Fredricka, because it's usually associated with conflict when you hear about it in the news.
Exactly.
But they're a resource for us as citizens, are they?
Absolutely. And
okay, good to know.
It's open there all the time. So you can go online, you can actually submit your claim and they will process it. Now, there is a desire to try and bring early resolution through a mediation process. So it's a particular type of mediation that the WRC use. It's not quite full mediation as per the Mediation Act, but it is to try and actually see if there is a way to resolve the issue before it goes to a hearing. But if an employee was to apply for the right to remote work and and it was a statutory entitlement and the employer was to reject it, then you can, I would say, use your internal mechanism first to appeal that decision. And again, this is where your company policy should have an appeal process. And I would say that about a lot of your policies, actually. It is a good idea to have an appeal process internally, because it just gives all parties the opportunity to step back from the decision and get it reevaluated by an independent person, somebody already not involved in the case.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah.
So we've put in the workplacerelations.ie website there. So that's kind of our legal resource.
Yeah, that's your neutral party, And again, obviously, as I say, you know, employees go there for various reasons and they still remain employees. So it's not that you have to resign in order to avail of that service.
Okay. Another question, Fredricka, you may not get through these slides.
That's all right.
So another question from somebody who asks, if an employee works up, you know, perhaps has accumulated their annual leave over 4 years, and they haven't taken that annual leave, they've got 28 days a year, which sounds like a lot. I'm sorry that person hasn't taken leave in all of that time. The question is, do they use it or lose it? Or would that be embedded in the contract of employment? Where should we kind of...
Yeah, it's an interesting, so 28 days, first of all, is 8 days above statutory. So that's quite a lot. And the working time directive, which is applicable to all people working in Europe, it requires that you must take at least 20 days annual leave in a 12-month period. So if you're not taking your 20 days, then you know, you're in breach of the working time directive.
Oh, you as an employee?
Yeah.
Okay, so you need to
take your time off, and obviously your employer needs to facilitate that. So so there is an onus on both parties, you know, under the working time directive. So that's the first thing I would say. And look, I think this certainly was an issue that was very topical during COVID, because one of the areas that I certainly from a HR point of view and business owners point of view was businesses that were down on resources or who found themselves in a really fast growth stage. It was probably difficult to get people to take holidays.
Mhm.
And then in the early days, if you remember, Rose, that we all thought it was only going to last a few weeks, that we thought
Yeah.
we'd hold on to our holidays
Yeah.
and head
Yeah.
away later in the year. And of course, we found out
Mhm.
that didn't happen. So that first year of the pandemic, a lot of people were carrying a lot of days. And there was, I suppose, an accepted situation that, you know, people were going to have more holidays than they should. And there was a general acceptance that if you needed to carry over a little bit more than you should into the next year, that, you know, companies would facilitate that. But under the Working Time Directive, you should not carry over your anything associated with your statutory leave. That should be taken in the 12 months. If you carry over additional time that you have, that is at the discretion of the employer, and that is, you normally see that in the annual leave policy. And you will see that there's something referenced to annual leave in your contract as well, but the details associated with the mechanics of how you operate it would generally be in your handbook under the policy and procedure. So hopefully that answers that question.
So there's an obligation on both parties to
Both
take
parties.
it and use
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. And again, I think employers would be well advised to keep an eye on working hours, keep an eye on employees taking the leave they should be taking. This year, as you know, we're going to have one extra day bank holiday. So now we have 10 days per year. So the whole idea of taking time away from work is to ensure you have enough rest periods. You're having enough time to de-stress and to just, you know, have a good balance in your life. So if managers and employees, you know, keep a close eye on this, and, you know, you should be kind of identifying maybe, you know, if there are roles that are in such demand and you have people working in positions where it's very hard for them to get time off, then really there is a situation there, I think, that you're just not resourced enough, and you need to think about, because it's not sustainable, and the chances are you're going to have you know, a well-being situation or a stress or an absence situation arising. And so, you know, try and be more proactive about it and create a more sustainable working situation, really. Yeah. Okay. So that's a sick leave. And then just to comment on the minimum wage, just it did go up again in January. It's now €11.30 per hour. And there is an expectation that it's going to move to being a living wage rather than a minimum wage by 2026. And a minimum living wage tends to be a higher rate than the minimum wage. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and then the other thing I just thought was no harm just to mention here was the payment of wages change in relation to tips and gratuities. You know, we're all probably a little bit more aware of this now, but and much of this change in the legislation was as a result, if you remember, there was a high profile case with a restaurant in Dublin where the staff objected to how the tips were being managed by management. And so they appealed that, and this change in the legislation really is because of much of that, you know. And so it now is regulating it a little bit more. And I think for all of us, when we tip, especially I think if we're tipping as part of our credit card payment or our virtual payment with our phone or card, we have an expectation, if we're putting a tip on that payment, that the tip will go to the staff.
Yes.
So now there's legislation making sure that happens. So that's not a bad situation at all. You know, it's better. Then the other piece of legislation that I want to talk about is this code of practice on the prevention and resolution of bullying in the workplace. So as I said earlier, there are two really important codes of practice on bullying and on harassment. Ordinarily, we would have had bullying and harassment within one policy, and the previous code of practice, it was sitting within one policy. And It very clearly defined what bullying was and what harassment, what sexual harassment, which is really important for us to understand. Because when you're addressing an issue in the workplace, it's important for employees to know which policy they need to use.
Okay.
Yeah. So this particular change now has separated those two. So now we have one specific resolution of bullying, and we have a separate one on harassment. So the code defines bullying. It also includes social media, that it can be through social media, and the same for harassment. So that's good that it has brought it into the online and virtual relationships. And it also introduces a new sort of, it definitely is encouraging parties to try and resolve the conflict through informal mechanisms. And it has introduced a mediation step. So the code will require policies to be updated. Okay, so again, there's a requirement in your handbooks to change. And you need to look at what provision you have in your contract. You know, depending on how you've worded a clause in your contract, it may well need to be updated as well. The other thing that this new code introduces is a contact person. So this contact person is really to be a signpost for within the organization. Now, depending on what size you are, that might be very difficult for you to have somebody internal. And we're seeing more that it's going to be an external person. Okay, so I know a number of our clients avail of our services as being that contact person, because either they feel the business is too small to have that neutral signpost person, or that they're just not resourced enough, you know. So the important thing about this contact person is that they don't get involved in understanding what the issue is. They don't probe or anything like that. It's very much important just to have somebody to go to say, look, a situation arose, or who do I go to, or how do I go about raising an issue that I am concerned about, of bullying. And you see, the thing is, you could be an observer to bullying as well. So it mightn't just be that, you know, it is you that's on the receiving end. So, and this is it's important that this contact person is suitably skilled and suitably trained. So that's the guide stipulates that. And as I say, they don't get involved in the resolution of the issue at all. So they have no party, they've no part to play in all of that. Okay. Now, there's lots more in the code, but the code is readily accessible, and you will find it on the WRC website as well. So this second code in relation to sexual harassment and harassment at work. So again, as I say, separate your policies, because you need a separate policy for this. It talks about the importance of an integrated part of your equality statement to have this policy. And just to clarify for anybody who might be unsure, bullying as defined is repeated actions. Okay, so wanted or unwanted. Okay, harassment can be a one-off incident. So it can be any incident associated with the 9 grounds under the equality legislation. So it doesn't have to be repeated. It doesn't have to be a pattern of behavior. It can be just one-off. And interesting, this new code is asking for a competent person to deal with the claim. So you can see the shift is moving to kind of having that middle person there to try and actually contain the issue, try and actually bring maybe early resolution, which is good because, you know, again, in these situations, the parties are still employees, you know, so you have to try and create a situation where they can all continue to work together. And sometimes that obviously can be very difficult depending on the situation. So again, lots of different aspects in this code of practice, but they're the highlighted versions that I would say. And again, important just to check your contract and your handbook, because they will need to be updated. I'm going through this in a whistle-stop tour, but like there's
Yeah,
lots of legislative changes, and
yeah,
obviously happy to ask specific questions as they
yeah.
come in, Rose.
I'm just thinking as you're talking, you know, this can be quite overwhelming for particularly small business, and the majority of our participants are small business owners. But I'm also thinking that you regret at leisure, don't you, if you don't put these. So we really need to update all our handbooks. Would we need to update our contracts as well, Fredricka?
Yeah, so it depends on what your clause, like you should in your contract, and I have a list of what you should have in your contract later on in the presentation, but
Okay.
you should reference these grievance and disciplinary and harassment and
Yeah.
like that in a contract, because they're such critical elements of the relationship. And any third party like the WRC will not take kindly to you as an employer not having these in place. They've developed these new codes. You can actually take the code and have that as your policy if you want. Like there's really good guidance in the code.
Okay. Is there? Okay. And that's on WRC.
Yeah. But you definitely need to have the policy, and you need to know how to use it. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
and I suppose we need the expertise, really, don't we?
It helps to at the outset definitely to understand it. Like we've seen cases where like dignity in the workplace obviously is a really important aspect of the relationship, and there is a duty of care that the employer will create a situation where all employees have the right to that dignity. And so it is about having your policy. It is about having sufficient training and making sure your managers know how to address a situation if it arises, but also being more proactive to prevent a situation arising, And, we've seen cases where companies did provide dignity at work training and all the rest, and yet a situation arose where somebody was negatively impacted.
Yeah.
And, the third party saying, well, you did provide training, but that was 3 years ago. You've got different employees there now. You weren't proactive enough in ensuring that your staff were familiar with this and that there was clear expectations set. So it is a good idea to have this on your agenda for your onboarding process. So there's while there's a number of steps you need to take. You need to have good contracts. You need to have the policies there, but you need to bring it to life. And bringing it to life means that you're putting it on the agenda. You're making sure it's on everybody's radar. You're being proactive about it, and also that you're, I suppose, investing in a culture and a workplace that is free from discrimination or free from harassment. And that you're clearly indicating we do not tolerate this.
Yeah, that's very, very, very wise advice, Fredricka. I know you have a lot to get through, but we have a question from Louise, which is just to ask your thoughts on something.
Sure.
I know you are a thoughtful person. It's not just about the legality of the situation and setting those kind of good structures in place for the organization. So Louise's question is, so Louise has a VA business.
Yeah.
She's just over a year trading and she needs assistance. But she has been working with people on a contract basis. So they are self-employed and contracted. So Louise asks, I'm just over a year trading, need assistance, but concerned about committing to employees as I may not be able to grow enough to keep them on. Is a viable alternative that the individual working for me X hours a week, they're choosing to be worked when they see fit, is a huge amount of flexibility allowed?
Yeah. So I think that's a very understandable question, Louise. And I think it's probably something that a lot of businesses, especially as you try and set yourself up, establish your market, establish your space and your offering, that you would like a more variable relationship with people to support you. And so, of course, you can provide flexible working arrangements. You can provide part-time or fixed term. There's a few different ways. The one thing to be really mindful when people are set up as self-employed or are set up with their own company registration, that so there's two sides to it. There's the revenue situation, how the revenue view that, and then how it's viewed from an employment law perspective.
Okay.
So I'm not a revenue expert, but let me just tell you what they tend to look for. So there is a very good guide on revenue.ie, and you can actually go in and you can test the relationship that you have, and it helps you establish, am I an employee or am I a contractor?
Okay.
And so the contractor term is that self-employed contract for services. So that means the employer is not paying taxes for you. The employer is not giving you holidays. The employer has not provided you with a laptop and mobile phone and whatever other services you need to provide the service, facilities to provide the service. So there's a number of different things it goes through, and it means that you have control over your working hours. So if you think about any relationship where you would engage the services of an external third party, then they are not solely dependent on you for their income. And the reason that's very important from a revenue point of view, obviously they don't want to feel that they're missing any revenue to be paid from the employer or from the employee, because as a self-employed individual, you pay a different rate of PRSI.
Okay, thanks for that, Fredricka.
So that's the revenue piece. And then
I sent that link. And then on the HR piece?
On the HR piece, there's been a lot of legislation introduced to prevent companies taking advantage of relationships with individuals and not giving them the security of a permanent contract. So if somebody's with you for longer than 12 months, they automatically have entitlement to 12 months or to unfair dismissal. Now, you could say that, well, I didn't give them a contract, but even if you haven't given them one, there is an automatic contract in place. If you're paying them for their public holidays, if you're paying them for their annual holidays, then an employee relationship is established. As
opposed to a contractor?
Yeah. So as a contractor, you shouldn't be paid for holidays.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the other thing then as well is just in relation to if you are their sole source of income and you're determining when they work, how they work, who they work with, it can be argued that actually it is an employee-employer relationship.
Okay.
And we have seen situations where there's been a backdated claim for compensation around unpaid holidays, unpaid public holidays, unpaid PRSI to revenue. So it is definitely something to pay attention to and to look at so that you don't find yourself in that situation. I mean, that flexible working, and when you're scaling your business, you might have a good, strong business case for not being able to commit to individuals in a permanent contract relationship. But that can only be for a period of time, and they don't stipulate how long. It's just a reasonable amount of time. So I suppose you need to have a good, justifiable business case for doing that. But it's short term, really.
Okay, yeah. So Louise says that's interesting. She prices based on 6 weeks off for everyone each year over and above. And she gives bank holidays.
Okay, that would be tricky.
Yeah.
So that again for sure.
Yeah, and interesting if you are the only source of income for that person. So it's really the government is trying to protect the vulnerability of the employee status, the contractor status. So we need to be conscious of that as employers and hiring contractors. Okay.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, even if you get somebody to sign a contract for services, it still won't be enough if what you're doing is different,
Okay.
And even, you know, it's funny the things that you see sometimes in place, but sometimes people have signed away their right to holidays. Well, if you're an employee, you have a statutory right to a certain number of holidays, you know. So again, even though you might say, well, the person signed it, if what they signed is not within the statutory entitlements, the statutory entitlements, you know, will trump it really. Yeah. So again,
yeah, Louise says, thank you very much. She'd like to get it right from the outset.
Yeah.
And so, but there is a business case if she doesn't have, for a short period of time anyway, if she doesn't have the financial.
Yeah. So again, but not if she's paying, like, so if you're paying holidays or anything like that, then it's an employee relationship. So, you know, because a contractor and a contract for services, they're being paid for the service. So that would mean they wouldn't be paid for time off. Now you can make a payment differently, maybe an incentive for them to deliver a project at within a particular time frame or whatever, but that would be within the provision of the contract, certainly not for time off.
Thank you. Is there anything, Christoph has asked, is there anything we can refer to about where an employee needs to have an automatic contract after working for 12 months for a company?
I've something on that in a few minutes. So
fantastic. Okay, we better let you proceed. Go
yeah,
ahead.
so some good guidelines for you on the contracts as well, because I thought, you know, this is an opportunity. It's the start of the year. I think we all try and set out with the best of intentions. It's a good idea to look at some of the structures and processes we have in place, and, you know, start making some improvements if there is a need to address some of those areas. So this next piece of legislation is protective disclosure. This is in relation to whistleblowing. Again, you should have a policy in place. You don't have to have it in your contract, but you should have it in your handbook. And at the moment, the law applies to the public sector and private sector with 250 employees, but it will be changing. So again, that's one that may not apply to you right now, but it could in the future. So again, just to be mindful of it. And again, it's interesting, Rose, you see, it's actually putting in this designated person so that, you know, definitely we're seeing that model of making sure that there is a clear person to go to for these things. Because, you know, that argument of, well, nobody came and told me. Well, did you set up the environment for people to be able to find out that information? That's the pushback, you know, that as an employer, you are expected to be reasonable and you're expected to create that environment where people know what to do and are able to access the proper channels if they need it. Okay, so that's just an interesting observation as well. So this one is definitely, I think, one you're going to be interested in. It's the new EU directive on transparent and predictable working conditions. So there's a few things that again, it's an EU directive coming in. So, you know, it is going to be applicable in Ireland. So the first thing is that it's saying you must give a written statement of terms and conditions of employment within 1 month. So that's to answer Christoph's query there. And it says these are the things that you must provide in that document. So it can be in an email or it can be in a contract, because even an email would potentially form a contract if you're setting out all of these terms. Okay. And additionally, the information that you provide must be provided before the 5th day of employment. And this is the additional amount of information you should provide. Okay. I would say it is good practice to, when you're making a job offer to somebody, you're going to make it probably verbally to start with, but then put it in writing, either in an email or in an offer letter. And once they have accepted, follow up with your contract. Now, some people might give the offer letter and contract together, and that's okay too. Sometimes an individual will want to see the contract before they say yes or no. We see sometimes people want to see the handbook before they say yes or no, because they really want to see how things are done within the organization before they
Yeah.
make that decision. And that's all reasonable. You might, you mightn't be too happy to have to do all of that, but it is reasonable. And again, what you're saying to the individual who you want to come and join you is, we're open, we're transparent. I've no problem with you seeing what we do and how we do it. Okay, because much of what you see in the contract and in the handbook is compliance.
Yeah.
And obviously you want to stay on the right side of compliance. So these are all the things, again, that you must put in writing and give to the employee within 5 working days. The other thing that this new directive is changing is the probation period. So we would have always been familiar with, you would be able to take somebody on probation for 6 months if it wasn't working out. You weren't sure, you thought, look, they haven't had enough time really to prove themselves, I'll extend it. And you would extend it anything up to maximum 11 months to take provision of the notice period. Okay. This new directive is saying you should not extend, the probation period should be for 6 months and not any longer, unless in exceptional circumstances. Now, that might feel a broad term right now, and let's see what it actually is like when we start seeing some of these cases go through to the WRC and how the adjudicating officers are evaluating it. But the exceptional circumstances right now would be, if the person was unwell for a period of time during the 6 months, it would be reasonable that you might extend it for an additional period of time. So that's interesting. So that means if your current contract of employment has a probation clause in it where you say that it is for 6 months, but we might extend it by 11 months or whatever, you will need to update that. Okay,
so that's a change we need to make to our contract. Just a note on that then, Fredricka, when people are asked to sign a new contract, there might be a bit of concern about that. Just do we require people to sign the contract, or how should we approach that?
Yes, I think you should have signed contracts in place. And again, if you do that at the outset, there's a better chance that everybody will sign. But even if somebody doesn't return a signed contract, the fact that they start working means that you have a contract in place. Okay. There are situations where, somebody could be working for 15 years, 20 years. They don't know if they signed a contract, that nobody has a copy of it. Well, automatically the core terms and conditions are there because they're already in a relationship. They're being paid a particular salary. They're getting X amount per month or week. They're getting their holidays, so there's all those statutory provisions that are automatically there. So they are in a contract. The difficulty, I suppose, is that, when it comes to something like sick pay, if you haven't clarified in your contract how that will be managed, or maybe you haven't clarified, things like confidentiality or non-compete, they should all be in your contract. There should be contractual clauses and contractual commitments between the two parties. And so you would be at a disadvantage if you didn't have that. Now this new directive is saying you must give it in writing. So again, it is, but already you're supposed to have a contract in place within a month anyway. Yeah.
And again, this is a directive, so it's not enacted.
But it
yet,
has been,
correct?
It has been applied with the Irish state have accepted it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it does need to be updated. Yeah.
Sure.
And then the other thing, the middle bullet I have there with regards to mandatory training, just for clarification, if you're employing somebody and you need them to have a certain standard of training and you for them to be able to do the job, then you're hiring them on the understanding that you will pay them to attend that training and that you will pay for that training. So this is just giving some clarity around that. So that you're not expecting the person to go and do the training in their own time, and you're not expecting them to fund it. So again, just to be clear about that. This third point here, Rose, I think is also very interesting. It's about double employment. Okay. So right now, under the Working Time Directive, if an employee works a second position or a third position or whatever, something beyond what their core employment is, they obviously need to notify both employers to make sure that they stay within the working time directive hours of work. So you shouldn't work more than 48 hours over an extended period of time, and you should get sufficient breaks. So again, coming back to that personal responsibility as well as employer responsibility. So some contracts might have a provision where an individual must ask permission or must seek permission before they take up a second role. Or they must advise their employer before they take up a second role. This directive is now saying that you cannot prevent somebody from taking up a second role. And but you can obviously have a restriction if they are, if it's a conflict of interest, or if you're concerned about the grounds of health and safety. So that would call into question the working time directive and whether the person is getting sufficient rest periods and breaks. So that's again very, very interesting. And you would probably have seen a case last year, I think it was. There was a Lewis driver who had taken a second job. I think it was as a taxi driver. And it was found that the employer was unfair to have dismissed them because they had taken a second job. So again, this directive would protect that as well.
Thanks, Fredricka.
But health and safety, obviously, really important. The working time directive, really important. So if you are taking a second job, again, having that conversation with employees, having some provision in your contract and in your policies to say you need to notify us and we need to make sure that you are working within the working time directive.
Sure.
Okay. So moving
we have
along.
A quick question, Fredricka. I know we only have 6 minutes left, so we might get this question in. And I don't know if you'll have time to go through it, but it's just a question on an employer's obligations if they have, and any specific taxation if a family member is to join the company as a director. But just to clarify, we won't be talking about taxation in this webinar, but I imagine if you take on a family member, that person has the same rights as any other employee, and the employer has the same obligations.
If you're taking them on as an employee, then they are an employee. And there's lots of cases where there's been conflict within a family situation. I think they can be the most trickiest. So definitely a good idea to document what the engagement is, what the terms are. Because sometimes that familiarity and sometimes the conflict isn't even about work. So the next few slides, we've covered a lot of what I have in the next few slides. So it's that whole idea of sustainable relationships. And here's just some nice stats for you just from the 2022 report from the CIPD, all around hybrid, flexible. And I think they're good data points for you, for everybody present to kind of reference. Also they're just, I would say, remembering this is a human relationship, and invest in both sides of that relationship. And ultimately what we want to do is create an environment where we can be at our best. So here's a nice graphic on that wellness wheel. If you are mindful of all of those different elements within the relationship, I think you will be in a good place and everybody will progress. Just again, the importance of there's so many different elements and dimensions to creating that environment. There's a lot of things. So mental well-being is probably something, Rose, we would not have had in this, if we did this webinar for you, we may not have talked about it.
It's so important now. I mean, how did we ignore it for years,
I know. So, it is across all areas now of the relationship. And so I think let's not, let's give it the status it needs. Let's be proactive about it and just create the environments where people can be at their best. I've also put in just a few things around goal setting. And I think really important, especially in light of the probation period change, you really need to be looking at making the best use of that 6 months in the probation. So set goals early, give feedback. Some important stats here about feedback. 92% of employees believe negative feedback can help them deliver better. So sometimes I think we're hesitant to give feedback when we think it might be tricky or it's not glowing. But look, people need feedback. And if you're not giving them the feedback that's relevant to them and what they're doing, it's a disadvantage to them. I talk about the probation period, and we've touched on an awful lot of that. And then the contract of employment. So here I've talked about the different types of contracts: fixed term, fixed purpose, permanent contract, and then obviously separate to the employee relationship is the contract for services. And just to bear in mind some of those different terms and different clauses that need to be in the contracts. So there we are, whistle stop tour.
That really was, and I know we don't have, we've got 2 minutes left, but if you could let us know, Fredricka, what's the best way of following up with you? It seems like you've given us a lot of resources there in terms of the takeaway for me is that we definitely need to update our handbooks, we need to update our contracts, and especially if we're kind of small business owners, it would be very good to have somebody like you or a company like yours provide us with that contact person, that intermediary who's separate from the business. And actually, Emma has just asked that question also. Where can I get more advice on contracts and which option is the best?
Absolutely, we'd be very happy to provide you with support. And again, look, we work with a lot of scaling businesses, a lot of startups. We try and provide supports that are proportionate to the stage you're at of your growth as well. And that contact person, designated person, all of those roles, it is a requirement that you have them in place with regards to these codes of practice. And so it makes good sense. And as I say, look, we're providing that service for a number of our clients for that very same reason. They just don't have anybody internally who can actually do that. So I'd be delighted to hear from anybody. I know you've shared our website. You'll also find me obviously on LinkedIn. Reach out to me at any time. And I know, Rose, I'm sure we'll be talking about another webinar at some stage. There's so many different topics I think we could talk about. So if people have particular topics they'd love us to talk to you about, by all means,
let us know. Yeah, definitely, certainly. And sometimes some of them are worth a deep dive. So Rebecca,
and we could have talked about any one of those.
I know, lots of them, but a really good kind of way to start the year and on our to-do list. So you've got lots of thanks in the chat there. Fredricka, I'd like to really thank you again for such clarity in your presenting. And I know Christoph had a number of questions. We haven't answered them all for you, Christoph, but Fredricka is there for you. And we also have those resources. The WRC is a good website. Revenue is a good website. Come to Accountant Online for any of your tax or your questions around that. And we do complement one another in those, so that the caring for the people and caring for the finances of the business. So we'll see you again very soon, Fredricka. Do let us know, any of you who are listening, either to the recording or live today, what else you'd like to hear. If you'd like to do a workshop or anything like that, just pop us a mail. And thank you very much, and best of luck to you all in your businesses in 2023.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Rose. And thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye.